Hello everyone. Recently Netflix put out a documentary on the Manosphere, as they call it, called Inside the Manosphere, unquote, by Louis Theroux. At least that's how I think his name is pronounced. Given that I'm a MGTOW who tries to keep in touch with MGTOW content and content in the periphery of our philosophy, such as the men's rights activist content, men's rights movement content, and the like, which constitutes the manosphere, regardless of if said content is made by us, those who support us, or those who oppose us. I have decided to volunteer to watch this documentary so that other MGTOWs who don't have Netflix or don't want to pay for it don't have to. And after having watched it, I have come to some conclusions and findings I find interesting that I want to share with you guys. So with that being said, let's begin. So, my first finding, and it's one that I find in particular strange: the complete absence of any mention of MGTOW or the phrase men going their own way, and the lack of mention of any channels or figures associated with the philosophy in the documentary. It would be one thing if MGTOW was mentioned, even in a negative context. Even in a negative tone and context, but there is a complete lack of any mention of MGTOW in any context whatsoever, as if it doesn't exist. The existence of the men's rights movement and its counterpart, the men's liberation movement, or the men's rights activism figures that we know of, even people like Paul Elam and the A Voice for Men, and Karen Strahan and her honey badgers, are simply not mentioned at all. And at best you have a vapid, rich online celebrities who purport to align with self-improvement principles for men and present themselves as such, but don't and are actually pick-up artists selling you stuff. This documentary does a good job of exposing such people, but the lack of mention of MGTOW and the idea of a manosphere existing, without the people that created it and laid the foundation for it, and only comprising of the worst pickup artists, is quite strange and quite jarring, to say the least. If it's any consolation, though, the fact that MGTOW appears to be entirely left alone means we might survive any new wave of negative sentiment toward the manosphere, as it will most likely be directed away from us and not towards us, so that is something that remains to be seen. My second finding, much like my first, is that most, if not all, of the men interviewed in this documentary are pickup artists of some description, with slight variation, but all basically holding the same ideals and ideology, with a few tradcon opinions seeping through as a slight alternative to the predominant pickup artist ideology. This is most evident when you see people like H's Tiki Talkie dropping game on random people, and people like him and Justin Waller selling courses, shilling courses, including the infamous The Real World platform, as it's called, made by the Tate brothers, who are currently facing several sex trafficking charges, with not much going for them in their favor, with also people like Sneeko pushing and shelling the two genders narrative, and also trying to claim credit for it, and for Trump winning the 2024 election. Which, by the way, I do not agree with, as I recognize the existence of being non-binary, even if it's controversial to say that. In particular, what is most evident when understanding the fact that none of this was about MGTOW was the fact that concepts like one-sided monogamy are being pushed, and the fact that Justin Waller himself is married, which is something MGTOW would never endorse or agree with. Marriage is not something MGTOW would agree with, and not something that we would ever agree with, and that is universal across the board. This is a documentary about pickup artists, first and foremost, and this fact has to be understood when looking at it and trying to derive conclusions from, if there's anything to learn from this documentary, that is. My third finding is that while the manosphere is discussed, its origins and how it came to be are not mentioned at all. You don't see any mention of the MGTOW manifesto or how things came to be. You don't even see the mention of the incels and their forums, despite them simply being parasites who contributed nothing positive to this community of men, known as MGTOW, or the Manosphere that's downstream from it. Or men's interests overall. Even the origin story of what the Red Pill is, with the Matrix movie and as the metaphor between the truth and ignorance, thus Red Pill and Blue Pill, is just glossed over and labeled as an ideology. Even the origins of the pickup artists, the main group this documentary seems to focus on, is glossed over and seemingly ignored in favor of mentioning their most recent actions in the latter half of the 2010s, and the entirety of the 2020s decade so far. So, by this account, the scope of this documentary, is far more limited than first thought of. My fourth finding is that the fundamental concepts that are always spoken about in these spaces are at best glossed over and at worst not mentioned at all, not even mentioned at all. What I mean by this is that things like no-fault divorce, in terms of how wealth and resources are distributed in terms of alimony and child support, and also child custody, in terms of primary custody defaulting to the mother, and also things like the Duluth model, as well as Briffault's law, and whether or not it is the correct understanding of relationships in the modern world, are simply glossed over and not talked about. These concepts, even if you don't agree with the merit of some of them, or think are flawed, need to at least be talked about and, in my opinion, are necessary to understand in order to have a correct and logical understanding of MGTOW, MGTOW values, and the Red Pill, and understand the concept in which MGTOW and the downstream of it, known as the Manosphere, exists in. A documentary on the Manosphere that does not cover the basic concepts one is expected to understand, in order to be able to think critically and have a correct understanding of not just the Manosphere itself, but in general about life, dating, relationships, marriage, and whether or not any of the latter three are worth it, is near useless and superfluous. One has to wonder, what was the point of this documentary if it doesn't cover the core fundamental concepts or the history of the subject it is trying to describe? Because the way I see it, it is a documentary on the PUA sphere, not the entire Manosphere overall. Finally, my fifth finding, and it's one that isn't really surprising for pickup artists, but is sad and dishonorable nonetheless that it happened, is the fact that there is some kind of anti-LGBTQIA+ bias present among them, that bordered on contempt, if not outright contempt or hatred. In particular, I can find H's Tiki-Talkie agreeing with the idea that he is homophobic at around the 58-minute, 50-second to 59-minute and 11-second mark in the show, and also a bit after claiming to not give, and also a bit after basically claiming to not give a fuck. And I have also seen him saying that he would disown his son if he came out as gay at the 8-minute, 34-second to 8-minute, 41-second mark, which shocked Louis Theroux, and I also took issue with, because it's bigoted and homophobic, and I do not, and never will, agree with anything or align with bigotry and homophobia of any kind. Also, like I said in my second finding, Sneeko was pushing and shilling for the two-gender narrative and claimed credit for it, or at least tried to claim credit for it, at the 1 hour, 10 minute and 54 second to 1 hour, 11 minute and 15 second mark in the show, even stating that he, the Tate brothers, and Fresh and Fit deserve credit for reinstating that narrative, which further proves my point. As someone who recognizes non-binary people for what they are, and has less of a conservative stance on gender, I am not inclined to like or support the efforts of Sneeko, nor would I endorse anything that H's Tiki-Talkie has been saying. Of course, none of what they do has anything to do with pushing forward MGTOW or promoting MGTOW values, which is what one would expect in a documentary about the Manosphere, but it's simply a sad fact that this is a documentary on the PUA sphere and not an actual Manosphere documentary. To sum up my opinion, based on the 5 findings, the documentary itself is accurate and high quality, but only to the subset of the pickup artists and tradcons being interviewed, as that is what you're getting. It is a big club and you ain't in it. This is a documentary primarily about interviewing a specific set of influential and rich celebrities, and just that. All you're getting is a heavy pickup artist focused ideological narrative with a side of tradcon ideology to keep things from being boring and to keep it entertaining for the average Netflix person watching this show. While I would like to praise Louis Theroux on his high quality of his documentary and journalistic ability, as well as commend him for exposing these people, as these pickup artists do indeed deserve nothing more than to be exposed completely and thoroughly, as they do indeed serve nothing more than to make MGTOW and the rest of the Manosphere look bad. I do need to state that I wish in this documentary it was made clear what kinds of people were being interviewed and who the documentary focused on, as well as a mention of the other communities in the Manosphere, including our own, as if there is a documentary actually focused on the Manosphere as a whole, including us. If there's a documentary about the Manosphere, in my opinion, it should include us. I do wish that the documentary actually focused on the Manosphere as a whole, including MGTOW, as a lot that could have been mentioned and is important to mention has merely been glossed over or ignored, making the documentary, while accurate for what it reported on, ultimately superfluous when looking at the bigger picture. The next time anyone does such a documentary, my advice, and I think most folks here who view this channel and are MGTOW would agree with me on this, is to focus on the bigger picture than just the worst of the worst pickup artists. I'm glad we kept our distance from the pickup artists like we always should, but we are also deserving of representation and visibility. With that being said, this has been Igor MGTOW and Video Games. Like and subscribe and click the bell notifications on YouTube if you enjoyed this video, and follow me on these alternate platforms known as Odyssey.com, MGTOW.tv, Twitter, Blue Sky, and Rumble. And join my Discord server, and bye bye. Thanks for watching.